The year of our Lord 1536 did not begin with thunder, but with the scratching of a quill against parchment, a sound so thin it should have been drowned out by the roar of the Thames. Yet, in the silent corridors of Whitehall, that scratching was the sound of a guillotine being assembled, piece by silent piece. History is often written in the blinding light of noon, but it is conceived in the grey hours before dawn, where the air smells of guttering beeswax and the damp exhale of old stone. And the second consort, the woman who had bent the spine of the church and rerouted the flow of empires, was no longer a woman of flesh and blood to those who watched her. She had become a mathematical problem. She was a variable that no longer balanced the equation of the king's desire. To look upon the court of Henry VIII in this twilight season was to observe a clockwork mechanism made of human nerves. Thomas Cromwell sat in his chambers, his shadow stretched long by a single candle. He was a man who understood that power is not a sword, but a ledger. He did not hate the Queen. Hatred requires an investment of heat that he could not afford. He simply looked at her, and saw a bridge that had served its purpose and now obstructed the view of the next shore. The air in the Queen's apartments was thick with the scent of dried lavender, and the metallic tang of fear. It is a peculiar thing, how the human nose can detect the onset of decay long before the heart admits it. And move through the galleries like a bird trapped in a cathedral, magnificent, frantic, and ultimately doomed by the very heights she had sought. One must wonder about the nature of time when one is perched upon a collapsing throne. Is a minute still 60 seconds when the king's eyes no longer linger on your face? Or does time become a viscous, stretching thing, like honey cooling on a winter's plate? For the silence of the king was a physical weight. It was the sound of a door being locked from the outside, a sound muffled by velvet but final as a tombstone. She stood by the window, her fingers tracing the leaden cames of the glass. Outside, the world was a palette of charcoal and bone. She thought of the men who had died for her, the martyrs of the old faith, the scholars who refused to swear the oath. Their ghosts did not scream, they merely waited. Perhaps that is what freedom truly is, the moment when you no longer have anything to lose, when the ghosts stop pointing their fingers and start opening their arms. Faith, in this court, was a garment changed to suit the weather. But as the shadows lengthened, and found herself reaching for something older than the Reformation, something deeper than the king's great matter, she reached for the terrifying honesty of the void. If the king was God's representative on earth, and the king had turned his face away, did that mean God had also retreated into the clouds? Or was God the very darkness that was now closing in, the cold that makes the stars seem brighter? In the kitchens, the servants spoke in whispers that carried the smell of roasted meat and wood smoke. They knew. The low-born always know when the high-born are about to fall. They feel the tremors in the earth like cattle before a storm. They spoke of the concubine, the night crow, names that stripped her of her crown before the law ever touched it. To be isolated in a crowd is a specific kind of torture. To be the center of a room and yet be avoided like a leper is to begin the process of dying while the heart still beats. The king's love had been a sun that scorched the earth. Now, the sun was setting, and the frost was reclaiming the land. Henry's love was never a gift. It was a loan with an interest rate that eventually demanded the soul of the borrower. He was a man who needed to believe in his own righteousness, which meant that for him to stop loving her, she had to become a monster. This is the alchemy of tyranny, the transformation of a beloved into a demon to justify the strike of the axe. And felt the shift in the very fabric of her dresses. The silk seemed heavier, the jewels colder. Her ladies-in-waiting, those who were not spies, looked at her with a pity that was more painful than any insult. Pity is a shroud for the living. It assumes the end before the end has arrived. As the first part of this dark chronicle closes, we see her sitting at her virginals, her fingers ghosting over the keys without pressing them. The music was already gone. There was only the rhythm of the guard's footsteps in the hall, a steady, rhythmic pulse that counted down the beats of a heart that had once dared to dream of a crown. The scent of the cold stone was rising, and the night was only beginning. If part 1 was the scent of cold stone, part 2 is the sound of heavy curtains being drawn. In the court of a king who believes his whims are the whispers of God, betrayal is not a sudden act, it is a slow, meticulous geometry. Lines are drawn between old friends, and angles of approach are calculated in the windowless rooms of the tower. The month of April arrived not with the promise of spring, but with a sharpened chill that seemed to emanate from the king's own presence. Henry had become a landscape of unpredictable weather. One moment, he was the radiant son of the Renaissance, laughing with his musicians. The next, he was a dark forest, thick with thorns and ancient, brooding silence. It is said that when a lion decides to hunt, the entire jungle holds its breath. At Greenwich, the breath of the courtiers came in small, white puffs of anxiety. Thomas Cromwell, the master architect of this unfolding drama, moved through the palace with the quiet efficiency of a shadow. He was gathering names like a gardener collecting poisonous seeds. To destroy a queen, one must first destroy the world she inhabits. He looked for the weak threads in the tapestry, the men who loved music too much, the brothers who were too proud, the servants whose loyalty could be bought with a handful of silver and a promise of safety. Silence is the loudest sound in a house of power. For Anne, the silence was now a physical barrier. She would enter a room, and the laughter would die like a flame deprived of air. She was still the queen, draped in the finest French hoods and gowns of cloth of gold, but she was becoming a ghost in her own life. This is the cruelty of isolation, it convinces the victim that they have already ceased to exist. She spent her hours watching the river. The Thames is a patient witness, it carries the waste of the city and the dreams of the ambitious with the same indifferent current. She thought of the nature of power, how it is a liquid that fills any vessel, only to be poured out when the vessel cracks. She had been the vessel of the king's hope for a new England, for a son, for a legacy. But the cracks were now too wide to ignore. In the dark corners of the armory, young men were questioned. Not with the rack, not yet, but with the more terrifying tool of suggestion. A hand on a shoulder, a whispered word about the king's displeasure, a hint that a confession could be a bridge back to life. Fear is a cold liquid that settles in the marrow. It makes a man look at his best friend and see only a way to save his own neck. One must reflect on the fragility of truth in such times. Is truth what happened, or is it what is recorded on the parchment that the king signs? In the chambers of the Privy Council, truth was being forged like a blade. It didn't matter if the accusations were impossible, it only mattered that they were consistent. The geometry of betrayal requires that all points lead to a single conclusion. Anne's brother George watched his sister from across the great hall. Their bond had always been their strength, a shared language of wit and ambition. Now, that bond was being twisted into a noose. He saw the way the guards lingered near him, the way the light caught the edges of their halberds. He realized then that freedom is not the ability to go where you wish, but the ability to remain who you are when the world demands you become a lie. The air in the palace began to smell of ozone, as if a great storm were about to break. It was the scent of power about to strike. And sat in her garden, the early blooms of April struggling against the late frost. She picked a primrose and crushed it between her fingers. The scent was fleeting, delicate, and entirely helpless. Time, she whispered to the empty air, is the only king that does not bow. She understood now that her life had been a long negotiation with a clock that was finally striking midnight. The king was no longer her husband, he was the personification of a history that had decided to move on without her. As we leave her in the garden, the first arrests are being planned. The lists are finalized. The quill has stopped scratching, for the orders are written. The night is deep, and the only light comes from the torches of the men who are coming to take the music away forever. The bitter beauty of the end is beginning to reveal its face. If the previous weeks were a slow calculation of geometry, the 1st of May was the moment the ink was finally cast upon the map. The air at Greenwich was deceptively sweet, filled with the scent of crushed grass and the distant, rhythmic thumping of hammers. It was the day of the annual tournament, a celebration of strength, chivalry, and the illusion of eternal spring. But beneath the bright pavilions, the atmosphere was as brittle as scorched bone. The king sat upon his dais, a mountain of velvet and jewels. To those who watched him, Henry seemed more like a monument than a man, his face a mask of practiced indifference. Yet, for those who knew the tremors of the court, his stillness was more terrifying than his rage. He did not look at Anne. His gaze remained fixed on the tilting ground, where men in polished steel shattered lances against one another in a ritual of controlled violence. Anne sat beside him, her spine as straight as a needle. She wore her dignity like a suit of armor, though it offered no protection against the cold wind of the king's disregard. She could feel the eyes of the court upon her, not with the admiration of previous years, but with the morbid curiosity of those watching a ship drift toward the rocks. In this theater of power, the audience always knows when the play is reaching its tragic conclusion. The smell of the day was a mixture of horse sweat, damp earth, and the faint, sweet perfume of the Queen's remaining ladies. It was a sensory tapestry of a world that was about to be torn apart. When Sir Henry Norris, one of the King's closest companions and the Queen's friend, fell from his horse, the King did not offer the usual gesture of concern. Instead, he rose abruptly, his movement so sudden it sent a shudder through the wooden scaffolding of the stands. Without a word to his wife, without a glance at the woman for whom he had once moved heaven and earth, the King departed. The sound of his heavy footsteps on the stairs was the sound of a final sentence being passed. It is said that in the moment of a great fall, there is a flash of absolute clarity. Anne watched his retreating back and understood that the man she had loved was gone, replaced by a sovereign who required her blood to cleanse his conscience. The ride back to Whitehall was a journey through a changing landscape. The King rode with Norris, speaking in low, urgent tones that the wind carried away. By the time they reached the palace, Norris was no longer a courtier. He was a prisoner of the King's mounting paranoia. The arrests had begun in earnest. One by one, the men of the Queen's circle were being gathered like sheaves of wheat for the harvest. In the quiet of her chambers that evening, Anne found herself in a state of suspended animation. She moved from the window to the hearth, her hands cold despite the fire. Faith, she realized, is not a shield against suffering, but a way to walk through it. She thought of the nature of a crown, how it is a circle of gold that binds the brow, a beautiful weight that ultimately isolates the wearer from the touch of common humanity. The smell of the river began to seep into the room, a reminder of the path that lay ahead. The Thames, which had once brought her in triumph to her coronation, was now waiting to carry her to the Tower. There is a bitter poetry in how the symbols of our greatest victories often become the instruments of our final defeat. As the guards finally arrived at her door, their faces pale under the flickering torchlight, and did not scream. She stood with a calm that was more unsettling than any outburst. She looked at the men who had come for her, men who had once bowed low at her feet, and saw only the weary agents of a destiny she could no longer outrun. "The King's will be done," she whispered, her voice a soft echo in the vast, emptying room. The music had stopped. The lights were being extinguished. As she was led toward the waiting barge, the first raindrops of a spring storm began to fall, washing away the scent of the May-Day flowers and leaving only the smell of the dark, rising water. The journey from Whitehall to the Tower was not measured in miles, but in the slow, agonizing dissolution of a soul's connection to the world of the living. The barge moved through the water with a heavy, rhythmic splash, the oars cutting into the dark surface of the Thames like a knife into silk. For Anne, the river had always been a road of triumph. Now, it was a funeral procession conducted in the damp, grey light of an unwanted dawn. As the boat approached the Traitors' Gate, the air changed. The open expanse of the river narrowed into a tunnel of stone, where the smell of rotting reeds and ancient mud grew thick. This was the throat of the kingdom, the place where ambition was swallowed and silence was enforced. The gate itself, a portcullis of rusted iron, seemed to groan as it rose, a sound that echoed against the damp walls like the laughter of a forgotten god. Stepping onto the slippery stone stairs, Anne felt the cold seep through her velvet slippers. It was a physical reminder that her status as a queen was now a hollow title, a garment that no longer provided warmth. She was led not to a dungeon, but to the very same apartments she had occupied during the nights before her coronation. There is a specific, refined cruelty in being imprisoned in the scene of one's greatest glory. The tapestries, though dusty, still depicted scenes of love and victory, mocking her with their frozen joy. In the tower, time does not flow, it pools. The minutes became heavy, saturated with the weight of the stone that surrounded her, and found herself pacing the length of the room, her footsteps counting out the rhythm of her anxiety. She was never truly alone, yet she was entirely isolated. Her guards were women chosen for their lack of sympathy, their eyes reflecting only the hard light of their duty. They were the king's mirrors, reflecting back at her the image of a woman already erased from the book of life. She began to experience the sensory distortions of the confined. The sound of a bird outside the window was as piercing as a scream. The smell of the tallow candles became a suffocating fog. In this state of sensory deprivation, the mind turns inward, and the memories become more vivid than the present. She saw the king's face as it had been at Hever, young, desperate, and filled with a light that she had mistaken for love. She realized now that Henry did not love people. He loved the reflections of his own desires within them. When the reflection changed, he shattered the mirror. What is freedom, she pondered, when the body is caged? Is it the ability of the mind to wander back to the orchards of Kent, or is it the terrifying realization that even the mind is a prisoner of its own fears? She thought of the men in the other towers, her brother, her friends. Their proximity was a torment, a silent chorus of suffering that she could feel through the very walls. Faith, which had once been a matter of intellectual conviction, was now her only anchor. But even faith feels different when the sky is reduced to a barred square of grey. The silence was broken only by the intermittent tolling of the chapel bell and the distant, muffled sounds of the city. London went on. Merchants sold their wares, children played in the gutters, and the sun rose and set without regard for the woman who had once been the center of the English universe. The world's indifference is perhaps the most difficult thing for the powerful to bear. To be the pivot on which history turns, and then to be discarded while the wheel keeps spinning, is the ultimate humiliation. As the first week of her imprisonment drew to a close, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew thinner, as if the stone were exhaling the cold of centuries. And sat at the small table, her hands resting on the cold surface. She no longer looked for the king's messenger with news of a pardon. She was preparing for a different kind of audience. The scent of the cold stone was no longer a threat. It was becoming a familiar presence, the only thing that remained constant in a world of shifting shadows. In the quiet of the night, she whispered to the walls. Not prayers for life, but requests for the strength to meet the end with the grace that the crown demanded. The bitter beauty of her situation was beginning to crystallize. She was becoming the legend that her life had not allowed her to be. The Queen of Glass was about to be tempered by fire, and the world was waiting to see if she would shatter or turn to steel. The great hall of the tower was a cavern of timber and shadows, where the air tasted of ancient dust and the sharp, metallic tang of expectation. On this day, the 15th of May, the hall was transformed into a theater of state. 2,000 people squeezed into the gloom, their faces pale lanterns in the half-light, all gathered to witness the unmaking of a queen. In the court of Henry VIII, justice was not a search for truth. It was a carefully choreographed performance intended to validate a foregone conclusion. And entered the hall with the poise of a woman attending her own coronation. She wore a robe of black velvet over a petticoat of scarlet, a stark contrast that whispered of both mourning and the blood that was soon to be shed. Her step was steady, her head held high, the crown upon her brow seemingly lighter than the invisible burden she carried in her heart. She was a master of the stage until the very end, understanding that while they could take her life, they could only take her dignity if she surrendered it. The smell of the hall was a suffocating mix of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the faint, sweet scent of the rushes strewn upon the floor. As she took her seat, she looked at her judges, a semicircle of the realm's highest nobility, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. Their eyes were averted, fixed on the parchments before them or the rafters above. It is a terrible thing to look into the eyes of a person you have decided to destroy. Guilt is a weight that makes the neck stiff and the gaze wander. The charges were read aloud, a litany of impossibilities that filled the air with a sense of the surreal. Adultery, conspiracy, incest, words that were meant to stain her soul but instead only highlighted the desperation of her accusers. And listened with a faint, enigmatic smile, the kind one might offer to a child telling a particularly transparent lie. She realized that in this room, language had lost its meaning. Truth was simply whatever the king required, loyalty was the willingness to echo his desires. Between the accusations there were moments of profound, ringing silence. In those gaps, one could hear the distant cry of a gull or the far-off hammering of a carpenter. These were the sounds of the world continuing to breathe while a life was being strangled. Anne's defense was a masterpiece of cold, sharp intellect. She met every lie with a fact, every shadow with a light. But as she spoke, she saw that her words were falling onto stone. The judges were not listening to her, they were listening for the sound of the king's approval. What is a trial when the verdict is written in the blood of the accused before the first word is spoken? It is a ritual of isolation. By the time the final vote was cast, and her own uncle pronounced the sentence of death, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and feigned righteous anger, and had already departed from their world. She stood as they stripped her of her titles, her face as calm as the surface of a frozen lake. As she was led back to her prison, the crowd parted in a wave of hushed awe. They had come to see a monster, but they had found a queen. The air outside the hall felt unnaturally fresh, the scent of the spring blossoms a cruel contrast to the darkness she had just left. She thought of the nature of power, how it can build cathedrals and burn cities, but it cannot force a heart to admit a lie. In the quiet of her chamber that night, the scarlet of her petticoat seemed to glow in the candlelight. She sat by the window, watching the stars. They were the same stars that had looked down on her father's house in Kent, indifferent to the rise and fall of dynasties. Freedom, she realized, was finally hers. Not the freedom to live, but the freedom from the need to please a man who could not be satisfied. The theater was over, the actors were weary, and the final act was waiting in the gray light of the coming dawn. The morning of the 19th of May arrived with a clarity that seemed almost insulting. The sky over the tower was a pale, translucent blue, the color of a forget-me-not pressed between the pages of an old book. There was no thunder, no eclipse, only the steady, indifferent return of the light. This was the final threshold. The scent of the morning was sharp and clean, the smell of dew on stone and the distant, briny breath of the sea-bound Thames. She dressed with a meticulousness that felt like a final prayer. No black this time, but a gown of dark gray damask over a kirtle of crimson. It was the dress of a woman who had already accepted the fire. As she pinned her hood, her hands did not tremble. There is a specific kind of peace that descends when the last door has been locked and the key thrown away. It is the peace of the inevitable. The walk to the scaffold was short, but it felt like a journey through the heart of time itself. The crowd was small, a privileged few gathered to witness the final beat of a heart that had once held the pulse of England. Among them were the men who had built the scaffold, the soldiers whose leather armor creaked in the silence, and the officials whose faces were masks of professional sorrow. The air around the scaffold tasted of iron. At the center stood the man from Calais, the specialist brought across the sea because the king, in a final, twisted gesture of mercy, had granted his wife the honor of the sword instead of the axe. The swordsman stood motionless, his weapon hidden in the straw, a master of his craft who knew that the most merciful blow is the one you do not see coming, and stepped onto the platform. She did not look at the crowd, she looked at the sky. She thought of the nature of memory, how it is a tapestry that we weave until the thread runs out. Was her life a tragedy, or was it a masterpiece of defiance? Perhaps it was both. She realized that the king had won the battle for the crown, but she had won the battle for the truth. He would be remembered for the strike, she would be remembered for how she stood to receive it. Her final words were not of anger, but of a quiet, devastating grace. She prayed for the king, calling him a gentle and sovereign lord, a phrase that hung in the air like a question that would echo for centuries. It was the ultimate act of power, to forgive the man who was killing her. In that moment, the hierarchy of the world was inverted. The prisoner became the sovereign, and the king, far away in his palace, became the slave of his own conscience. As she knelt, the cold of the wood felt like a benediction. The smell of the straw was dry and earthy, the last scent of the world she was leaving. She closed her eyes and whispered a single, repetitive prayer. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. The words became a rhythm, a heartbeat that replaced the ticking of the clock. The blow, when it came, was not a sound, but a sudden absence of weight. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a stone falling into a deep well, the silence of a candle being snuffed out in a great cathedral. The world would go on. The king would marry again before the week was out. New queens would rise, new conspiracies would be hatched in the shadows of Whitehall, and the Thames would continue to carry the waste and the dreams of London to the sea. But something had changed. The Queen of Glass had shattered, and in the fragments, history would forever see the reflection of a woman who dared to reach for the sun, only to find that the sun is a cold and lonely star. The bitter beauty of the conclusion is this: death is not the end of a story, but its final editing. And Boleyn was no longer a woman of flesh, blood, and fear. She was now a ghost, a legend, a warning, and a witness. As the sun climbed higher over the tower, casting long, thin shadows across the empty scaffold, the scent of the cold stone remained, but for the first time in many years, the air felt light. The cage was empty, and the bird had finally found the sky.
Like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.